When Jonathan opened the door on a cold January morning, he expected to see only snowdrifts and white silence. But his old dog Gray stood at the threshold, breathing heavily, with frozen paws and a strange object in his teeth. At first, Jonathan did not understand what exactly she was holding. Only when the dog carefully placed the find on the porch boards and stepped aside, he saw the hat. He recognized it immediately. It was a knitted gray hat with a red stripe, the same one he had knitted for his son Lucas for his 9th birthday, the same one the boy wore every winter, the same one he had lost the night he disappeared into the woods 10 years ago. Jonathan's ears were ringing with silence. He knew he had no right to believe. Too much time had passed. Everyone had long since resigned themselves, everyone except him. And yet he stood up. He pulled on his jacket. He took the lantern. He put his hat in his bosom like an amulet. "Dad!" The voice was weak, hoarse, like the whisper of leaves in the wind. Jonathan took a step forward, but Gray lunged at him and growled. It was a strange, low growl, full of alarm. The dog stood between him and the boy, as if trying to stop him. Jonathan's heart was pounding in his chest. His mind was racing, searching for explanations. Was it possible that his son was alive, that he had been here all this time? But something was wrong with this boy. He looked like Lucas, but there was something alien in his eyes. Like he was looking right through Jonathan, like he knew more about him than a child should know. "Dad." The voice sounded more insistent now. The boy rose to his feet and took a step forward. Gray growled louder, bristling. Jonathan stood on the edge. Every cell in his body screamed that something was wrong. But love and longing were stronger than fear. Gray stood up. The dog stood straight like a soldier before an order, without fuss, without fear. He extended his hand. And at that moment the boy smiled. That smile was wrong, predatory. And then Jonathan understood. He found the wrong person. Jonathan froze in place. His outstretched hand trembled in the air like a taut string. He looked into the boy's face and could find nothing familiar in it. Only emptiness, dark, bottomless. The boy took another step forward. The wooden floor creaked under his bare feet. There was no light from the lantern reflected in his eyes. There was only deep shadow. Gray stood between them. The fur on his back stood on end. The dog growled so low that the rumble went through the floor and into Jonathan's feet. He had never heard Gray make such a sound before. It wasn't fear, it was a warning. "Daddy," the boy repeated, holding out his thin hand. As Jonathan stepped over the threshold, the snow crunched under his boots. The door slammed behind him. The world narrowed to a narrow path leading off into the forest. Gray went first, turning around to check if the man was following him. Jonathan took a step back, his chest tightening. Everything about this place screamed danger. The hut, the stale air, the child's voice. Too empty to be a real child. Even his memories seemed distorted, as if he were looking at his life through a glass. The boy tilted his head to the side. His smile grew wider. His lips stretched too far, too unnatural. "Why did you leave, Dad?" he whispered. Jonathan felt his legs grow heavy. Guilt pierced his consciousness, the same guilt he had carried inside him all these years. Guilt for not having been there. Guilt for letting the boy wander alone that damn day. Guilt for not having been able to save him. "Dad, don't go," the boy asked quietly. Gray lunged forward, growling so fiercely that Jonathan instinctively took another step back. The dog stood between him and the figure, protecting him. The dog did not let the boy come closer. His whole body was shaking, but he did not retreat. Jonathan caught Gray's eye. There was a desperate demand in those eyes. "Go away." He took another step back, then another. The lantern in his hand shook. A spot of light darted across the walls. The boy was no longer smiling. His face was blank like an icy mask. He looked straight into Jonathan's soul. There was something ancient in his gaze, something cold, something that was only pretending to be a child. And Jonathan went. He knew there was no way back. Today he would either get back what he had lost or remain in this emptiness forever. "Dad," he said quietly, and then his voice changed, deeper, hoarser. "Stay." The hut creaked. The walls seemed to shake at the word. Jonathan backed toward the stairs, keeping his eyes on the boy. Gray retreated with him, still growling. When Jonathan reached the first steps, the boy suddenly rushed forward. Jonathan barely had time to jump up and slam the hatch shut. Scratching and grinding sounds came from below. He leaned his whole body on the lid, feeling something pushing it from the inside. Gray barked hysterically, bursting into dull thuds. Jonathan stood up with difficulty, grabbed an old crowbar from the wall and stuck it into the hinges of the hatch, blocking the passage. Silence fell instantly. Only the dog's heavy breathing and his own trembling chest filled the dark room. He stood motionless, listening. The forest was waiting. Not a sound. Not a rustle. No voice. Only the forest outside where the blizzard swirled its endless song. Jonathan looked up. On the wall, right next to the ceiling, an inscription was written in black smoke. Welcome home. He realized that he could not stay here for another minute. Running out into the street, he felt the icy wind hit his face. The snow was thick, heavy. The lantern barely penetrated the darkness. Gray darted towards the path, looking at him and clearly demanding that he follow him. The snow crunched underfoot. The forest welcomed them into its domain silently, without warning. Every step along the path seemed to Jonathan like a step into the past. His heart beat fast and hard, as if protesting where Gray was leading him. Jonathan ran. They ran without looking back. They ran through the forest in which shadows stood behind every tree. They ran, knowing that the night had not yet let them go. And somewhere in the depths of the forest, a voice followed them. Dad, Dad, Dad! They ran as if death itself was breathing down their necks. Jonathan could barely make out the road ahead of him. The flashlight barely illuminated the path through the thick curtain of snow. Gray raced ahead, looking back every few seconds, as if checking that the man was still nearby. Jonathan didn't know how much time had passed. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe an hour. The forest around him was the same, confusing the direction. The tree trunks swayed in the wind, creaked, whispered something in their ancient language. Somewhere behind him among these trunks, a voice still rang out, calling him by name. Dad, Dad, Dad! With every step, that voice grew weaker, but it was still there, ghostly, persistent. Jonathan was exhausted. His feet sank into the snow. His breath came in gasps. The flashlight twitched in his hand. He stopped, bent over, his hands on his knees, and gasped for air. Gray walked up to him. The dog nuzzled his palm, wagging his tail barely noticeably. There was no fear in his eyes, only heavy concentration, as if he knew the way back, as if all this time he had been leading Jonathan to where he needed to go. The dog walked ahead confidently, without hesitation. The dog did not sniff, did not search. He knew the way. Jonathan caught himself thinking that he did not recognize this path. 10 years ago, he had walked the entire forest, combed every hole, every lowland, every cave. But this path looked as if it had only just opened up, as if it had been waiting all this time. Jonathan looked up. He saw a blurry shape through the snow. A wooden bridge over a stream. He knew this place. It was an old part of the forest where he and Lucas had once gone to catch frogs and launch bark boats. But something has changed. The bridge was skewed. The boards were icy and cracked. There was no cheerful stream running underneath it. There was only black, motionless water, frozen in dead silence. Gray stepped onto the bridge first. The boards creaked pitifully under his weight. The dog walked forward without stopping. Jonathan hesitated. His heart screamed that he couldn't go any further, that everything here was wrong. The forest, the water, the air. But he took a step, then another. He froze in the middle of the bridge. Below him in the black water, not only he and Gray were reflected, there were other shadows there too. Hands, faces, little silhouettes of children, reaching up as if trying to get out of this frozen river. Their eyes were empty, their mouths open in a silent scream. The world around was strangely silent. No birds, no cracking of branches. Only the howling of the wind somewhere high in the treetops, and the light steam escaping from Gray's mouth when he breathed heavily, without slowing down. Jonathan recoiled, but the boards under his feet began to slide. He barely kept his balance. The wind grew stronger. It carried with it the smell of rotten water, rotting leaves, and something else. Something old, forgotten. Gray turned sharply, standing between Jonathan and the side of the bridge where the path led. The dog growled as if he were facing an enemy. And then Jonathan saw her. At the edge of the forest, between two old fir trees, stood the figure of a woman. She was motionless, her face hidden by a hood. One arm hung limply. In the other she held something long, like a rope. The woman did not move. She just stood and looked. Jonathan felt fear squeeze his chest. He knew it wasn't human. He knew it instinctively. His body was telling him what his mind refused to accept. Gray barked. His voice was hoarse, desperate. The woman raised her head. Her face was completely blank, a white mask without features. Just smooth skin, no eyes, no mouth. And yet Jonathan felt that empty gaze piercing him right into his soul. It took about 15 minutes before they reached a fork in the road. Two roads diverged. One was wide and well-trodden, leading to a frozen stream. The other was narrow, barely visible in the deep snow, and went into the thicket. He stepped back. The bridge groaned under his feet. Gray turned and ran back across the bridge. The dog barked, called, demanded that he run. Jonathan, without thinking, ran after him. They burst back onto the path, and behind them the boards creaked. Jonathan turned as he ran and saw the figure of a woman glide across the bridge without stepping on it. She seemed to float above the boards, not touching them. He ran, stumbling, falling into the snowdrifts. Gray ran alongside, showing the way. The lantern flew out of his hand and went out in the snow, but Jonathan no longer paid attention to it. He heard only one sound, that same voice. Dad. But now it didn't sound like a request. There was a threat in it. Gray didn't think twice. He turned onto a narrow one. Jonathan paused for a second, peering ahead. This part of the forest looked alien. Even the air seemed different. Heavier, saturated with dampness, and the smell of old leaves hidden under the snow. The snow burned his face like sharp needles. Jonathan ran without looking where he was going. He didn't know where north was or where south was. The forest was the same on all sides. The branches hit his cheeks, pricked his arms, tore his clothes. But he didn't feel any pain. He ran because he knew that if he stopped, they would catch up with him. Gray flew ahead like a shadow against the white landscape. The dog did not slow down. He knew the way. He was pulling them out of this nightmare. There was a rustling sound behind him. Something was sliding between the trees, leaving no trace. Sometimes Jonathan thought he heard breathing right behind him, heavy, cold, dead. Dad. The voice caught up with him, clung to his thoughts, penetrated into the very depths of his consciousness. It sounded from all sides at once, from under the snow, from the dark corridors between the trunks, from inside the heart itself. But he didn't answer anymore. Jonathan knew no matter what he said, this creature would only use his words against him. Gray turned right, leading him to where the forest thinned. A clearing loomed ahead, a ghostly strip of light in the endless night. The final push. He gathered the rest of his strength and rushed after the dog. Jonathan froze in place, feeling a cold sweat run down his back. His breathing became heavy. It took him a moment to bend over and pick up his hat. The fabric was frozen, covered in frost. But under his fingers, he felt the familiar rough knit and the thin snag at the edge, which he himself had once sewn with rough stitches. He took a deep breath and walked on. When they ran out into the clearing, the snow seemed to stop falling. The wind died down. The forest behind them became as silent as a grave. Jonathan turned around as he ran. Nobody. Only darkness, devouring everything around. He fell to his knees, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his temples and his lungs burning with the effort. Gray stopped next to him, touched him with his nose, as if checking if he was alive. Then he sat down, staring towards the forest. There, at the edge of the trees, something was standing. The woman's figure was no longer hidden. She came out from behind the tree trunks as if the night itself had spat her out. An empty face looked at them. The dark fabric of her clothes fluttered in the wind, which was not there. Other silhouettes began to appear behind her. Children. Lots of children. They walked for a long time. Time seemed to lose its meaning. The light from the lantern caught only the nearest trees. Further on, everything was drowned in gray darkness. Sometimes it seemed that something was moving between the trunks, that someone was watching. Their faces were as empty as the woman's, no eyes, no mouth, just smooth white skin. They stretched out their hands to him, thin, pale, crooked. Jonathan stood up slowly. He understood. Everything that had happened that night had led him to this moment. These were not ghosts, not visions. It was something ancient, something that fed on pain, guilt, memory. These entities were not looking for bodies. They were looking for souls. And tonight the forest chose him. Dad? The voice was now in his head, loud, insistent, full of power. At one of the turns, Gray stopped. His fur stood on end. He growled quietly, barely audible. Jonathan came closer and saw why. Jonathan closed his eyes. Fragments of memories flashed through his mind. Lucas laughing in the summer sun. Lucas riding an old bike. Lucas falling asleep on his shoulder after a long day. These memories were real, and what stood before him now had nothing to do with them. He opened his eyes and looked straight at the woman. "I'm not yours," he whispered. The figures froze. Gray rose to his paws and barked, once, loudly, so loudly that the sound tore through the stillness of the night. And then something changed. The woman bowed her head. Her body trembled, as if the thin film hiding her true essence was beginning to crack. There was a glove lying on the snow. The first line appeared on her empty face. Crack. A black liquid flowed out of it, dripping into the snow, leaving behind smoking spots. Behind her, the children began to melt, dissolving into the air like smoke. Jonathan realized that their power was crumbling. Without running away, without letting go of his gaze, he took a step forward. "I'm taking my life back," he said out loud. The snow cracked under his feet. The wind rose with renewed strength, whirling the flakes in a mad dance. Gray rushed towards him and stopped next to him, almost pressing himself against his legs. There were two of them against a whole forest of shadows. A child's glove, blue with a faded bear design on the back, the same pair Lucas wore that winter. But tonight the night had to end. The wind whipped his face, stirred up the snow, turning the forest into a white abyss. Jonathan stood on the border between himself and what had once been his fear. He felt the night pressing on his shoulders, the empty eyes of the entities burning through him. But inside there was no longer any fear or guilt, only determination. The woman took a step forward. Dark liquid was pouring from the cracks in her face, as if her very shell was falling apart. Behind her, the ghost children had almost melted away, their silhouettes fading into the air like smoke from a dying fire. Jonathan stepped forward. Gray was nearby, his breath a hot stream burning his hand. The dog no longer growled. He stood silently, as if understanding that the moment had come when the man himself had to fight for his life. The woman raised her hands. Her fingers were long, twisted. She reached for him, but each gesture was slow, as if the air resisted her movement. A low moan escaped her chest. It echoed through the forest, shaking the frozen branches of the trees. Jonathan did not back down. He took a child's hat out of the inside pocket of his jacket, the same one that Gray had brought him at the beginning of the night. A hat that smelled of the past, warm, real. He raised her high above his head. It wasn't a weapon, it was a memory, it was love. Jonathan crouched down and slowly picked it up. It was cold, frozen through and through, but the fabric was remarkably well preserved, as if someone had dropped it recently. Love that nothing could distort. Neither pain, nor guilt, nor darkness. The woman shuddered. Her body shook like an aspen leaf in the wind. The wind grew stronger. The snow swirled in a furious whirlwind. The forest howled with thousands of voices in which weeping and rage were mixed. But Jonathan stood. Gray raised his head to the sky and howled. A long, drawn-out, pure sound. This howl cut through the night like a knife. The woman screamed. Her voice was not human. It was the sound of ice breaking, of a falling tree crashing, of the forest itself groaning. Her body began to fall apart. Cracks crawled across her skin, her dress, her arms. Black shadows burst out of them and dissolved into the air. Behind her, one by one, the ghostly children disappeared. Their faces were no longer empty. For a moment, expressions of pain, regret, and liberation appeared on them. And then they were gone, dissolving in a whirlwind of snow. The woman took the last step forward. He looked at Gray. The dog was staring ahead, into the darkness between the trees, as if he knew what was beyond. Jonathan shoved the glove into his pocket. His head was spinning with an overwhelming feeling. Fear, hope, pain. Jonathan looked at her without lowering his hand with the hat. She extended her hand as if trying to touch him, but before her fingers touched the air in front of him, her body crumbled into dust. Everything became quiet. The snow slowly settled on the ground. The wind died down. The forest froze, as if after a long, painful battle. Jonathan stood in the middle of the clearing, clutching his hat in his hands. Gray came up and nuzzled his thigh, reminding him that he was here, that he was alive. The man fell to his knees. He did not cry. There were no tears. There was only a heavy, deep fatigue. As after a long return home, he understood. All these years he lived in a trap of guilt and pain. The forest took his fears and molded them into monsters. But he was no longer afraid. He accepted the past, accepted the loss. He knew one thing. He had no choice now. The hat could have been an accident. But two things, the glove and the hat, they couldn't have been just a coincidence. And it destroyed the darkness. He raised his head. At the edge of the forest where the entities had just stood, a narrow path was now visible, leading towards the house. A real home, where life still awaited. Gray barked briefly and moved forward. Jonathan stood up, put his hat in his bosom and followed him. The way home was long, but he knew that now he could get through it. The road home went through a silent forest, where the snow now seemed lighter. Every tree, every branch, seemed to straighten out with relief after a long imprisonment in a nightmare. The forest breathed slowly, deeply, like a creature awakening from a long sleep. Gray stepped forward, and at that moment something flashed in the darkness. Jonathan walked slowly, Gray walking next to him. The dog did not take his eyes off him. There was no haste in their movements, only a heavy, conscious fatigue. The hat pressed against his chest, warming him through the fabric of his jacket. It seemed that there remained a thread to the world he had lost. But now this thread did not tear his heart apart. It connected. Sometimes it seemed to him that in the depths of the forest someone was walking nearby, quietly, invisibly, but not hostile, not dangerous, as if the very memory, the very love of Lucas accompanied him on this last journey. He went out to the bridge, the same bridge that a few hours ago seemed like a gateway to another world. Now it stood quietly, peacefully dusted with snow. Under it, water ran again, clean, sparkling in the dim light of early morning. Jonathan stopped. At the edge of the bridge, right on the railing, lay a small wooden boat, simple, roughly carved from bark. The letter L was inscribed on it. He took the boat in his hands. His fingers felt the rough surface, the smell of damp wood. His chest tightened. He remembered how many years ago he and Lucas had built such boats and launched them down the stream, competing to see whose would float the farthest. Gray came closer. The dog quietly bowed his head, looking up at him. The lantern caught a shadow, fast, low, human. Jonathan squatted down at the water's edge. The wind touched his hair, gently and carefully like a familiar hand. He put the boat on the water and let it go. The current picked him up. The little boat floated forward, taking with it everything that was left in this forest. Pain, fear, guilt. The boat glided across the water, disappearing around the bend in the lightning pre-dawn fog. Jonathan stood up. His heart no longer ached. Where there had been emptiness before, there was now a quiet, heavy but right feeling. Parting. Gray barked softly and set off, with Jonathan following behind him. When they reached the edge of the forest, the sun was already rising. The first rays tore through the gray sky, painting the snow in pinkish hues. Ahead of him was his old farm. The black roof, the crooked fence, the trodden path to the porch. Everything was just as he had left it. But now this place seemed different. No logical explanation came to mind. Everything screamed about the impossibility of what was happening. He stood in the middle of the porch, in the blinding white light, clutching in his hands a piece of the past that had no right to exist here and now. Jonathan raised his hand sharply, illuminating the space in front of him, but there was no one there anymore. Only the wind ruffled the snow-covered bushes. Not a prison. Home. Jonathan paused for a moment at the old oak tree in front of the house. His hand fell on Gray's fur. The dog raised his head and looked at him, and there was so much warmth in that look that Jonathan allowed himself to smile for the first time in a long time. He knew. Lucas was here in every snowflake, in every gust of wind, in every drop of running water. He was a part of this world, a part of its heart. And that means he will never be completely alone. Jonathan walked up the creaky porch steps and opened the door. The warm air of the house greeted him with the smell of wood and ash. Gray walked inside first, looking over his shoulder as if inviting him to enter. Jonathan crossed the threshold. He froze. His heart was pounding so hard that the roar echoed in his ears. There was a feeling that someone was very close, that someone had just stood between the trees and watched. He's back. The house greeted him with silence, but it was no longer the empty, oppressive silence to which Jonathan had become accustomed over the years of loneliness. Now there was something different in it. Warmth, peace. He took off his jacket and carefully hung it on a nail by the door. He put Lucas's hat on the table, like a relic, like a shrine. Next to it lay a notebook and a small wooden toy. Everything that he had brought with him from that long, terrible night. Gray lay down by the fireplace, stretching out his paws and resting his muzzle on his front paws. The dog was tired. He had lived through the night on par with the man, without retreating, without hesitating for a moment. Jonathan lit a fire in the fireplace. It took a while for the flames to catch. The dry logs crackled, the flames licked them, and lit a light in the dark room. The house was filled with a soft orange light. He sat down in a chair by the fireplace and looked into the fire for a long time. The wooden walls creaked as if the house was quietly breathing with him. There was silence inside, a silence in which there was finally no pain. Jonathan closed his eyes. Lucas's face came into view, that same look, mischievous, alive. He heard his laughter. He saw the boy waving at him from the bridge over the stream. He smiled. There will be no more emptiness in this house, because love, once sown, never dies. It remains, in the air, in the trees, in the heart. Gray growled again, louder this time. He took a few steps forward, then looked back. His eyes glowed in the light of the lantern, and there was something more than fear in them. Gray barked softly in his sleep. Jonathan opened his eyes, looked at the dog, and felt his heart fill with gratitude. For this night, for the chance to come back, for someone to lead him through the darkness. He stood up, walked over to the door, and opened it wide. The morning was clear. The sun rose over the forest, turning the snow into a golden scattering of diamonds. The forest stood silent, but there was no longer a threat in its silence, only strength, only life. Jonathan took a step over the threshold. He knew there was a lot ahead of him, that the pain would not go away forever, but now he had a way home. Gray stood up, stretched, and followed after. They stood together on the porch, looking at the brightening sky. Somewhere far away, in the forest, a thin voice, almost inaudible, whispered the last word. Jonathan gathered all his strength and walked on. Every step was hard. His feet sank into the snow, the cold penetrated to the bones, but he walked. "Thank you." Jonathan lowered his head, closed his eyes, and smiled. He knew that he had not heard it by accident. And now he was ready to move on with his life, with hope, with faith, with a memory that will stay with him forever. The dog led him deeper and deeper into the forest. And then he heard a voice, quiet, childish. "Dad." Jonathan stopped. The lantern dropped down. His hands went numb. "Dad." Gray looked at him silently. There was no fear or excitement in his eyes, only a calm, heavy confidence, as if the dog knew what he was doing, as if he had brought into this house not just a thing, but a message. The voice was weak, as if coming through a thick wall of snow and time, but it was real. Gray barked shortly and sharply, as if confirming what he had heard. Jonathan took a step forward, feeling a shudder run through his heart. He didn't know what awaited him around the next corner, but now there was definitely no turning back. Jonathan stood in the middle of the snowy forest, clutching the strap of his flashlight as the light fumbled helplessly through the trees. His heart was pounding in his throat. Blood was ringing in his ears, and every second he caught himself thinking that he was about to lose his balance. The voice was still there. It was weak, barely audible, but it was his son's voice. He knew it by heart, there was no doubt. Lucas was calling him, asking for help. Gray stood nearby, his ears pressed to his head, but his tail tensely frozen in the air. The dog looked in the direction from which the sound came, as if he was ready to rush into the darkness at any second. Jonathan stepped forward, once, then again. His legs trembled treacherously, but he walked, forcing himself to move. Every second it seemed that the forest was shrinking around him, that the trees were leaning closer, that someone or something was watching his every move. The path had become narrower. The snow underfoot was packed down, as if someone had passed here recently. Jonathan leaned down lower, shining the flashlight. He saw prints, small, as if left by a child. Jonathan peered at the tracks in the snow. There weren't many, just Gray's paw prints leading toward the forest path. No human tracks, no snowmobile, no sled, no car, no one else. My soul sank into my heels. He raised his head. There was something hanging on the trunk of an old maple tree ahead. Jonathan came closer and froze. There was a jacket hanging from a nail driven into the wood, a small blue jacket with a torn pocket and a broken zipper. His hand automatically reached for the fabric. His fingers touched the material, and he felt that it was not frozen. The jacket was warm, as if someone had just recently left it there. "Dad," the voice sounded louder, closer. Gray whined quietly. He didn't rush forward, didn't stretch back. He waited. Jonathan understood that the dog felt much more than he did. He felt fear, but didn't run, so he had to go. Jonathan pulled the jacket off the nail and squeezed it in his hands. It smelled of campfire smoke and dampness. Inside the pocket, he felt something hard. He pulled the object out and saw a wooden toy, a small carved knife, the same one he had once given to Lucas as a gift. The toy was cracked but whole. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the scents, taking in all these signs as proof that he had not gone crazy. Gray barked, one short bark filled with alarm. He slowly looked down at the hat and smelled it. Not just the smell of old wool and snow. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible scent of the baby shampoo Lucas always used. It smelled as if the boy had worn the hat only yesterday, as if he had gone out for a walk yesterday morning and promised to be back for dinner. Jonathan's head snapped up. A shadow flashed between the trees. He rushed forward, forgetting about caution. Branches whipped his face. Snow flew into his eyes. The flashlight bounced in his hand, tearing individual pieces of reality out of the darkness. Gray ran alongside, easily maneuvering between the trunks. There was a man in front of him, a small figure in dark clothes. Jonathan could only make out its outline. The figure flickered between the trees, disappearing into the haze of the snowstorm, but always remained within sight. He screamed, called, but his voice was drowned out by the wind. "Dad!" The whisper passed very close. Jonathan stumbled, fell to his knees, but immediately rose and ran on. He felt neither cold nor tiredness, only a desperate desire to catch up. The forest ahead parted. They ran out into a small clearing surrounded by an old windfall. In the center stood a hut, small, lopsided, almost fallen apart from time. The roof sagged under the weight of the snow. The windows were boarded up, The door was ajar. The figure disappeared over the threshold. Jonathan's hands were shaking. He wiped the snow off his hat, as if he were afraid to harm the memory he held. His chest tightened with pain, as if time had suddenly compressed, turned into one endless second between the past and the present. Jonathan stopped at the edge of the clearing, breathing heavily. The lantern picked out the hut from the darkness like an island in a sea of fear. Gray growled, the fur on the back of his neck standing on end. Jonathan took a step forward, then another one. The snow under his feet seemed too soft, as if it was ready to collapse. Everything inside him screamed to stop, to turn back, but he already knew. All he had left was behind this door. He reached for the handle. There was absolute silence in the hut. He pushed the door and it creaked slowly, opening the way for him to enter. The dark room smelled of mustiness, burnt wood, and something strangely familiar. And then he saw it. On the floor, right in the middle of the room, lay an old school backpack. A notebook covered in childish handwriting stuck out of a torn side pocket. He did not realize how he found himself in the house. He put his hat on the table next to the cracked lamp and sat down in an old armchair, heavily lowering his head into his hands. There were no thoughts in his head, only a dull, dull beat of his heart, and a strange feeling that in this silence someone was addressing him. There was a name on the cover, Lucas Miller. Jonathan stood in the dark hut, feeling the cold creep up his spine. The notebook in the old backpack seemed impossible. Its cover, stained with earth and soot, left no doubt. It was Lucas's school notebook. He had bought it himself, together with his son, just before the start of the school year. A small gray notebook with a green stripe along the edge and a scrap of an old sticker in the corner. Jonathan picked it up from the floor with trembling hands. The notebook was heavy with moisture, but the pages inside were intact. He turned the first one, ragged lines, homework, childish scribbles, and at the bottom of the page, in neat letters, written for Dad. The voice called out to him again from the depths of the forest, quiet, barely audible, but now it sounded different than before. There was pain in the voice, as if the child was hurt or weak, as if time was running out. Gray growled and moved slowly toward the back wall of the hut. His face was tense, his movements cautious. Jonathan followed him automatically, clutching the notebook so tightly that his knuckles turned white. A hatch was found in the corner of the house. Steps led down into a dark basement. The smell of dampness became stronger, mixed with something metallic, sharp. It smelled of old pipes, rust, and something else that Jonathan could not immediately identify. He illuminated the passage with his flashlight. The beam picked out a narrow staircase leading into the darkness. On the bottom step there was a footprint, small, a child's. The snow stuck to the sole melted, leaving a wet spot. Jonathan closed his eyes for a second, gathering his courage. He had to go. Otherwise, everything he had been through that night would be meaningless. He put one foot on the ladder, then the other. The wooden steps creaked under his weight. The lantern trembled in his hand, drawing ghostly shadows on the walls. Gray followed, almost touching his thigh. The dog came closer. She nuzzled his knee with her nose, and then sat down by the door, not taking her eyes off the forest path visible outside the window. The wind was driving snow dust outside the glass, but in the distance, between the dark tree trunks, it seemed as if someone was standing or waiting. The basement turned out to be small. Stone walls, low ceiling, pieces of furniture, old buckets, torn rags were scattered in the corners. In the center stood a chair. Another find was hanging on the back. A jacket, smaller than the one Jonathan had found earlier, childish like for a 7-year-old boy. The letter L was embroidered on the sleeve. He took a step forward and suddenly realized that he was not alone. A rustling sound came from the shadows to the right, as if someone was slowly moving their foot across the floor. Jonathan raised his lantern and illuminated the corner. There was a boy sitting there. He was thin to the point of transparency. His skin was pale. His eyes were huge and dark. His hair was matted, and there was a fresh cut on his cheek. The boy looked at Jonathan with an expression that mixed fear, fatigue, and inexpressible melancholy. He clutched an old stuffed animal in his hands, the same one Jonathan had once won for Lucas at the fair, a small gray bear with a torn-off ear. Jonathan froze. The boy raised his head a little higher. His lips trembled.